Um, yeah, so I, in preparation for this show, I've been going down the Phoenician rabbit hole, and it's rather interesting. Uh, what what are your thoughts on it, Doctor?
Yeah, I think before I get into that, I want to give a little disclaimer here, okay? um, well, in my moon landing group and in my moon landing YouTube page, uh, there's a couple subjects which I don't go into, and one of them is religion, and one of the reasons is because I have a lot of Christian friends, and and I don't want to say things that will offend people's religion, you know, and I myself am a Christian, but my version of Christianity is very, very different from others. And so that's why I don't normally go into this subject we're about to go into today. So let me explain that a little bit more. So I guess you can say there's two kind of Christians, like those who who support Israel and those who don't support Israel, right? And there's some famous names in that, like some old school Christians who are quite outspoken against Judaism. One of them was Ted Pike. I don't know if you remember him. And then another was Tex Mars. Tex Mars. The point is this. Now I'm coming to myself because I'm quite different from both of them. What they believe is that Jesus was fighting against the Jews back in his days, and so it's up to us as the Christians of modern day to carry on that same work and to fight against that. And one thing important to note here is that the Jewish people back in the days of Jesus were a completely different group of so-called Jewish people, which are the problem in the world today, because back in the time of Jesus, they were dark-skinned Jews, and today there's the white-skinned Jews. So so today we're fighting against the Khazarian mafia, and those dark-skinned Jews still exist today. They're just called the Mizrahi. Okay, the Mizrahi. When the white-skinned people started showing up in Palestine, and they saw these dark-skinned Jewish people were still living there. They never left. And so they just said, okay, these are the Mizrahi. That's the name for the Jewish people who have always lived in Palestine ever since, thousands and thousands of years ago. So the people we call, which you are calling Phoenicians, the technical name which they're called today are the Mizrahi. Okay, so but let's come back to myself. The difference, why I'm a little bit different, is because yes, I am a Christian, but I am a very strange kind of Christian who does not accept the Old Testament at all. So you won't find, I never heard any Christian like that before. I've never heard any Christian who completely throws out the Old Testament. I've never met any other Christian like that. So, and I'm not trying to impose my beliefs on anybody, but I'm a historian, and so when you look at the Old Testament, um, of course, it was written by a guy named Josephus, and that book is pretty much a fairy tale. It's completely a fairy tale, with people living in the bellies of whales and the great floods and things like that. And but he does end up mixing in some real history with his fairy tales. Okay, so now the question is, where do the fairy tales end and where does the real history begin? So this is where is the line, where is the line where the fairy tale ends and the real history begins? So there's different opinions on that. Um, so if you ask most Jewish scholars, if you ask most Jewish scholars, where did the fairy tales end and where does the real history begin? Most Jewish scholars will say that this period of Egyptian captivity is a fairy tale. It never happened. Okay, there's no proof of that. But then they will say the period of Babylonian captivity is real history. Okay, so this is the Jewish scholar opinion. Of course, regarding Christians, there's so many different opinions. Some Christians will go along with the Jewish opinion that the Babylonian captivity was real, but the Egyptian captivity was a false. And some Christians also believe the Egyptian captivity was real. And some Christians believe, the man living in the belly of the whale was real and the great flood was real. So they just believe the whole thing. so so this is where I am different because I draw the line at a different place. What I'm saying is that of course the in the belly of the whale, the flood, the Egyptian captivity, all that was fairy tale. But also this so-called Babylonian captivity was also fairy tale, you know. And so this is what we're going to be talking about today is this period of Phoenicians and where does real history begin? Okay. And so let me just say one last thing here is that I'm actually quite an expert on this subject because I'm a coin collector. I have coins. I have a series, all these dates. I'm about to give you a list of dates and events that happened. And all of these events, I actually have coins for these dates and these people and these places. I have coins which go back 5,000 years, So, so, I'm quite an expert on Phoenicians and, I have all these Phoenician coins which I'm about to mention. So, this is, I'm quite, I'm into the historical perspective. And when you actually have coins of these people and these dates and these times, you can prove that this was an actual historical event. So this is my disclaimer. I am a Christian, but I am a weird Christian because I don't accept the Old Testament, meaning that where I draw the line between fairy tale and history is at a completely different place from where most other people draw that line.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm a former believer, and I guess I have different views as well. But yeah, it's and for me, my non-belief is has been just going back in time and where does everything have an origin? Where did this have its origin? Um, as far as your study, and you're probably going to get into it, but does it go back into the Canaanites?
Right. So regarding regarding this land we call Phoenicia or the Phoenicians, there was an ancient the land known as Phoenicia used to be called Retgenu. Retgenu was the Egyptian name for Phoenicians. So, in order to understand the history of Phoenicia, it's we you have different sources. You have Egyptian sources, Greek sources, Roman sources, and then of course you have the Old Testament, which you need to take with a grain of salt, right? So yeah, Canaan, the land of Canaan. Yes, there is a historical evidence for the so-called Canaanites, and we'll get into that also.
All right, yeah, I'm interested in Uh, Seeing what you have to say, like I said, I've been going deep into this, and it's truly fascinating stuff. Uh, I mean, I listened to a 3 hour podcast by I think the show's called Rise and Fall of Civilizations, and they recently did a show on the Phoenicians. It was they only do put out a show like once every 6 months or so. I mean, and so their most recent episode is on the Phoenicians, and the 15-minute mark of that recent episode is pretty hilarious. Um,
This period of the people which you call Phoenicians, they've changed their names several times throughout history. So I've kind of divided this into 7 different sections, okay? The first were the Akkadians, okay? So the Akkadians was their first name, and then they changed their name to the Assyrians, and then they became the Phoenicians, and then they became the Carthaginians of Carthage, and then they became the Hasmonean dynasty, and then they became the Herodian dynasty, and finally there was the post Herodian dynasty, what happened after the Herodian dynasty. So these are the 7 sections of history which I would like to talk about today. Okay, any questions on that before I jump into this?
None.
Okay, so let's start off here at the beginning. So supposedly the year was 2334 BC, and this was the beginning of the Akkadians. And what happened around that time is a rough dates. They're still debating over these dates, but
Just to
his
clarify,
name
you're talking about around 2300 BC, right?
2334 BC
Yeah. Okay.
is the date which most archaeologists agree on. Still debate over that. But there was a famous king by the name of King Sargon of the Akkadians. Now, what happened was King Sargon, you know, his hometown was in modern day Syria. Okay, so they came down from Syria into Iraq and invaded the Sumerians. Okay, so the Sumerians were living a very peaceful existence down in southern Iraq, and then all of a sudden this clan of Akkadians showed up. Now, what happened was the Sumerians had developed metal. They were farmers and they were using metal as their plows. They were plowing the field with these metal hoes. But then all of a sudden the Akkadians showed up and they decided to use metal in a different way. They decided to use metal as swords for killing people rather than just farming. So the Akkadians were basically the first warriors to ever use metal swords, okay? And so they literally just butchered these Sumerian people. The Sumerian people were living a very peaceful life as farmers, and then all of a sudden these Akkadians showed up and started butchering them. So the Akkadian dynasty lasted from 2334 BC until 2154 BC. Okay, so roughly about 200 years, they had controlled both Syria and Iraq. The entire Tigris Euphrates area was controlled by these Akkadians, and it all began with this so-called King Sargon was the first leader to lead the first battle to go down and invade Sumeria. Okay, so then what happened after that was their empire crumbled apart, and then the Sumerians, their name changed after that. So they became known as the third dynasty of Ur. That was the name of the Sumerians. And then eventually, after this third dynasty of Ur, they became known as the Babylonians. Now, the thing is this: these Sumerians or Babylonians, they had a slightly darker color skin than these Akkadians. The Akkadians come from Syria, and they had a slightly lighter color skin. So they would capture the dark colored skinned people and made them their slaves because they felt that the lighter color skin meant they were superior beings. So that racist mentality began roughly 5,000 years ago when the Akkadians invaded the Sumerians, right? So then eventually these Akkadians they came back to power and their name changed again. They became known as the Assyrians. Okay? So these Assyrians, the Assyrian dynasty went through three phases. We called this the Old Assyrian, the Middle Assyrian, and the Late Assyrian. And the Late Assyrian, otherwise known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Okay, so I want to go through a history of that now, because the thing is, when you talk about Phoenicia, Phoenicia is just a series of seaports of the Assyrian Empire. That's what it was. The Assyrians had spread over to Palestine and Lebanon, and the Phoenicians were just a series of seaports set up by the Assyrian people. Okay, so now let's go over the history of the Assyrians. And if you have questions, you can just jump in at any time.
No, no questions. I'm listening. If
All
I
right.
get to a little point that I might chime in, I'll let you know. But I'm
Uh,
good right now.
all right. So actually, I mentioned that I have coins for all these dates. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about different coins and things like that. But what I want to mention is that back in the Assyrian and the Akkadian days, they didn't necessarily have what we call coins. That wasn't the main system of currency. What they had was these little rolls. There was it's called a cylinder seal, where they would write on clay tablets, and then they had a stone which they rolled across the clay tablet, and that left an impression on the clay tablet. So that was their signature. So these it's a stone cylinder seal where they rolled across the clay tablet, and that left an impression, and that was the signature of the wealthy man who owned. He was a slave owner, okay, and so he would leave his roll, and so that was his signature. Like, his signature was the money, right? So, but what's interesting to note here is that they back in the Assyrian Akkadian days, they invented a system of currency known as the shekel. Okay, so the system of currency which is being used today, called the shekel of Israel, started way back then in the Assyrian Akkadian times.
Now, was this before they started delving into the what is it, the Cyric snails? The using the purple dye.
That it was around the same time. There were several sacred stones and sacred dyes they would use to color for their clothes, and
Yeah, because
you know
the Well, and I just wanted to mention this because um, from what I researched was that this dye only came from snails from that region. That was the only place, and it took, I can't remember how many. It took like thousands of snails for like one tiny little kilogram of dye, and
Right.
so because it was such a laborious uh, task to produce this dye, it was very valuable, and so that's what the royals wanted. The elites wanted this dye so that they could use their robes. And if you look at today, fast forward to today, I mean, uh, look at the popes and such. It's still being used, but it was a symbol.
Yeah.
Uh, it was to symbolize royalty, elitism, whatever, and that's what gave them a foothold in that market because they started trading for it. They were the ones that figured that out, and I thought that was a very interesting little piece that I ran into as far as the snails that are
Right.
particular to that region.
Right, the purple dye. They also, what was another sacred stone was the lapis lazuli, that the blue stone was a very precious stone. And there's also a kind of a red sea coral. So the very, very rich and elite would collect certain stones and certain dyes for their clothes. Yeah. But what's interesting, they did invent this system of shekel, and also it's important to note there's one document which is called the Code of Hammurabi. Okay, the Code of Hammurabi was a giant, it's a giant stone where they, it's the first legal document which still exists today. You know, they probably had created earlier legal documents, but they were all destroyed. But this one still exists today. It's called the Code of Hammurabi, which was created in 1792 BC. And the Code of Hammurabi laid out the legal framework. And in that legal document, where they wrote the laws, basically, they had written a two-class system of slave and slave owner. Okay, so this system of slave owner began with the Assyrians and the Akkadians, and it's the same people who created the system of currency known as the shekel. Okay, so these are racist people, and and the system of shekel today is still being used by racist people, but it's being used by a different race of people. The people who are using shekel today are the Ashkenazi, who are Khazarians, right? But they still practice the same racist philosophy where they believe that they are the slave owners and the rest of the world are their slaves.
God's chosen people.
Right. That whole system, like
Yeah.
the emperor, or what you call the king, was also like a God's chosen. So God chose certain people to be the rulers and to be the slave owners, and God chose the rest of the people just to be the simple slaves for us to control. So that same system of a racist mentality has been in existence ever since King Sargon of the Akkadians invaded the dark-skinned Sumerians, right? 5,000 years ago. So let's go into a little detail about these Assyrians. As most people know, the Assyrians and the Babylonians had been battling off and on, and sometimes the Assyrians won the battles, and sometimes the Babylonians won the battles. But let me go into a little detail about this time period. So the what you call the old Assyrian Empire was from 2025 BC until 1364 BC. They started coming back into power. So around 2025, the Assyrians again invaded Babylonia. Okay, and they had set up colonies on the coast of the Mediterranean, and those colonies became known as the Phoenicia, right? So in the year 1862, the Egyptians invaded Phoenicia. They said, "We want these seaports for ourselves." The Egyptian name for Phoenicia was Retjenu. Retjenu was the Egyptian name. And the first Egyptian king to invade Phoenicia was Pharaoh Senusret III. Okay, in the year 1862 was Pharaoh Senusret III. Now, what happened was eventually the Egyptians lost control of Phoenicia, and then the Assyrians started gaining power because they had conquered Babylonia. And so when the Assyrians started rising up in power, the Phoenicians also rose up in power. So the Phoenicians eventually became so powerful that they themselves invaded Egypt. So at this period of time, the Phoenicians became known as the Hyksos. Okay, the Hyksos was the name of the Phoenician people once they had invaded Egypt. Okay, so the Hyksos, they also had another name. They became known as the 15th dynasty of Egypt. Okay, so the 15th dynasty of Egypt were the Hyksos, and they were the Phoenicians, and they were the Assyrians. It's the same people, just different names. Okay, and then you can go into a lot of detail because they were speaking what's called the Canaanite language. You know, the Hyksos documents were written in the Canaanite language. Okay, so they controlled Egypt for roughly around 100 years, from around 1650 BC until 1550 BC. The Hyksos had controlled southern Egypt. And then finally, there was one Egyptian pharaoh known as King Ahmose. King Ahmose regained, kicked out the Hyksos, and he also eventually invaded Phoenicia. So around these dates are really hard to pin down, but it's around 1582 was when King Ahmose went, and he, after he had kicked out the Hyksos, he pushed them up into Phoenicia, and then himself also invaded Phoenicia. And then eventually there was one Egyptian by the name of Tutmose the First, who in 1504 invaded Phoenicia once again, and this time he was able to maintain control of Phoenicia. So Phoenicia was an Egyptian colony rather than an Assyrian colony. Okay, so that lasted for about 400 years. Okay, where Phoenicia was an Egyptian colony, and the Egyptian called it Retjenu. Okay, so that was the name of Phoenicia that the Egyptians called it. Now, there was no Egyptian captivity. You know, like Moses parted the sea and led them for freedom from Egypt. So um, so that never happened, and there's no evidence of anything like that. You can check through the Egyptian documents. What did happen was, the Hyksos had conquered southern Egypt. That did happen, and King Mose did drive them out. So, but some of the Christians try to look for this Moses, right? Like, when did that happen? And they say that this happened during the reign of Tutmose II. They try to look for historical evidence of when these so-called the Canaanites were slaves of the Egyptians, and they say that somehow it happened during Tutmose II. But there's no historical evidence of this anywhere. There's nothing to prove this. That Tutmose II never took any slaves, you know. And so anyway,
Well,
this kind
I
of
mean, just the
ends.
I mean
Yes,
the as far as the Exodus is concerned,
right,
another I guess if people are kind of getting angry and like, oh, what are you talking about? Of course, it happened. It's just the archaeological evidence for it doesn't exist.
right. And so also, it's also important to note here what I mentioned about myself being different from most Christians is that when I deny the Old Testament, the main thing that I'm denying here is this so-called first temple. Okay, so according to the Old Testament, there was a first temple, and that temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then they built a second temple, and that second temple was destroyed by the Romans, right? So for me, there's no evidence for this first temple at all. What they called their second temple was actually the first temple. Okay, so I'm going to get into that later, but the, but coming back to the Exodus, you know, most Jewish scholars will agree that this Exodus never happened. There's no archaeological evidence for it. Okay. So, but the difference between me and other Jewish scholars is that they try to find archaeological evidence for this so-called first temple, which never existed. And that would we might have to do a whole nother show on that, because there's a Wikipedia page called archaeological evidence for this so-called first temple period, and that stuff can be debunked, and that would be a whole nother show, is just to go through that Wikipedia page of archaeological evidence of the first temple, and point by point I can debunk it, but that would be a whole nother show. Okay.
Well,
So let's come.
Dr. Raza, my show is your show, and whenever you want to cover topics, just holla at your boy. But yeah, I'm not worried about. I know some other people are a little timid when it comes to certain subjects or things they want to talk. I don't care. Uh, like I said, I mean, I love to hear it all and all kinds of subjects from all kinds of points of views. I mean, that's how I feel personally. I gain more knowledge, even if I don't agree 100% one way or this way or that way. I'm able to challenge my own views, my own mindset. So I love it. And the fact that when you come, you got your notes written down, you've studied this, you're working on books. uh I mean, this is stuff that you are
Right,
are very knowledgeable. It's just you you always got to double check, no matter who's saying it. You always
right,
want to verify it. It doesn't matter
right.
if I'm saying it, doesn't matter if Dr. Raza is saying it, whoever's saying it, you want to double check, triple check. And so that was the first time I had heard of it when you mentioned it. So sometimes you see my head down. That's what I'm doing. I'm taking notes. And after the show, I went down and I was like, "Holy
Check.
shit! How the hell did I go all my life not knowing about this?" And
Right.
it was one of many enlightening moments.
Let me mention one other thing here is, as I mentioned, you have the Assyrians, and which is divided into three periods: Old Assyrian, Middle Assyrian, Late Assyrian, and before that was the Akkadians. Now, I actually have coins and cylinder rolls from all these time periods. Now, I told you I'm writing a book, yes? But what's very interesting is this is not just a book. Actually, what I'm doing, I'm actually in the future going to build a museum. I'm actually, because I have a lot of coins, from the Assyrians, Akkadians, the Phoenicians, and in the
And how
future,
did you
people,
collect these coins? Just the
just
different ways?
yeah, yeah. I have a lot
Okay.
ancient, and even the whole show we did on the this history of the Khazars, and all of these names and dates I mentioned. I actually have coins for all of that as well. So like the Phoenician history, the Khazarian history, and the modern day, Illuminati, all these important names and dates I mentioned, I actually have a coin for each one of those dates. So when you come to my museum in the future, you'll be able to see this. This book I'm writing is just like a manual for the museum. It's like these are the names and dates, and then you can come and see the coins. In the book, you'll be able to see a photograph of the coin, but in the museum, you can actually see the coins themselves. So all these important things are going to be there. It's going to be really fun, in the future. So let's come back to my timeline here. Okay, so we finished what's called the Old Assyrian period. The This is when the Hyksos gained control of Egypt for a time period. Then what happened later was called the Middle Assyrian period. The Middle Assyrian dynasty lasted from 1363 BC until 912 BC. This is called the Middle Assyrian period. Now, this began in 1363 when Ashur-uballit invaded Babylonia in 1363. And then what happened was, after that, in 1350 BC, there was a pharaoh of Egypt known as Akhenaten who started to lose control of Phoenicia. Okay, so he started slowly losing control of Phoenicia. But then in 1294 BC, another pharaoh by the name of Seti I went back up into Phoenicia and regained control of Phoenicia. Okay, now another one was another Assyrian king known as Tikulti Ninurta. He also attacked Babylonia. Okay, so this was in the Middle Assyrians. The Assyrians kept on attacking Babylonia and trying to regain Phoenicia from the Egyptians. Okay, so Tikulti Niruta attacked Babylonia in 1243. Now, a very interesting thing happened after that was around the year 1200 BC, the Phoenicians gained a new name. They were known as the Sea People. It's kind of a vague name they give for the people. They don't know where these people came from. They just came on boats. And the Sea People attacked the Mycenaeans of Greece, and they attacked the Hittites of Turkey. So this was both the Mycenaeans, their civilization really suffered, and the Hittites also, their civilization just completely collapsed due to several factors, but one of them being attacks from these so-called Sea Peoples. And these Sea Peoples were just the Phoenicians, the Assyrians, the Akkadians, the Hyksos, whatever name you want to call them, the Canaanites, whatever name you want to call them, it's the same people, okay? So now another event that happened was the Phoenicians. Okay, after the Sea People attacked Greece, they attacked Turkey, they started becoming very powerful. They became so powerful that they wanted to attack Egypt again. So there was an Egyptian pharaoh by the name of Ramesses III, and in the year 1178 BC, Ramesses III have to fight off these Phoenicians. You know, the Phoenicians tried to attack Egypt, and but Ramesses III defeated them. No, you can't beat Egypt. You know, and what's interesting here is that in this document, okay, this Ramesses III was writing, you know, his document about the attack, and he called these people Paliset, okay, Peliset. So this is very interesting because the name Palestine is actually older than the name Israel. You know, a lot of modern day Jewish people say, well, Israel existed before the name Palestine, but this is simply not true. Ramesses III was the first to change the name. Before, the Egyptians referred to Phoenicia as Retjenu, and then later they changed the name to Peliset. So actually, the name Palestine is much older than the name Israel. The name Israel didn't appear until much later, and we'll go into that later. So let's come back to our timeline. The Phoenicians tried to invade Egypt again in the year 1140 BC, and this pharaoh was the name Ramesses the Sixth. And at this time, the Phoenicians were so powerful that they actually defeated Ramesses the Sixth. Okay, so around the year 1140 was when the Phoenicians were really at the peak of their power. And there's a famous story which happened after that. So there was an Assyrian king by the name of Tiglath-Pileser, and Tiglath-Pileser wrote in his journals about his travels to the west. So he was an Assyrian king living in Syria, and he traveled to Phoenicia, and then he got on some boats and he traveled across the Mediterranean, and he probably even traveled to Carthage. So this was the beginning of the Carthaginian Empire. So it's the same people, the people in Carthage, the people in Phoenicia, the people in Assyria, it was the same people, you know. They were all using a shekel as their currency, right?
Yeah,
So,
let me real quick, Doctor. I found that clip that I wanted to play for you from. This is from the
great.
podcast Fall of Civilizations.
Mm.
Huge show. And listen to this. Let me know what you think, Dr. Raza and audience. But interesting stuff.
The Phoenicians' early voyages around the Mediterranean led to them encountering many other peoples, and among these they began to cultivate a reputation as uncompromising traders and shrewd businessmen, something that seems to have gained them some degree of unpopularity. Homer's Odyssey, probably written down in the 7th or 8th century BC from even more ancient oral traditions, describes the Phoenicians as cunning and untrustworthy, in contrast to the supposedly noble Greeks.
Thither came Phoenicians, men famed for their ships, greedy knaves bringing countless trinkets in their black ship.
That was the clip I wanted to play. I mean,
Right.
I don't know if you're going to go into it a little deeper, but I did. It's pretty impressive what the Phoenicians were able to do as sailors. I
Right.
mean, hell, they made it as far north as freaking England, for crying out loud, and they made it.
Yeah.
There's legends, and there's even evidence to back up that they made it around the Horn of Africa. And
Right. Right. So let me jump back in here to my timeline. Is that so we finished what's known as the Middle Assyrian period. So after the Middle Assyrian period, we come to what's known as the Neo Assyrian period, the Neo-Assyrian dynasty. So the Neo-Assyrian dynasty lasted from 934 BC until 612 BC. Okay, so that's when the Assyrians started coming back to power for the fourth time, really. There was first they were called the Akkadians, and then they were called the Old Assyrian, then they called the Middle Assyrian, and then now they're called the Neo-Assyrians. Okay, so one of the most famous ones was Tiglath-Pileser III. Tiglath-Pileser III captured Babylonia in 729 BC, and then Esarhaddon was another Neo-Assyrian emperor who managed to capture both the Egyptians and the Babylonians. So this was the peak of Assyrian power. Assyria extended all the way, all of Iraq, all of Syria, all of Phoenicia, and all of Egypt. It was a huge empire they controlled. But that empire didn't last very long. It only lasted a few years, and then it started crumbling. And eventually the Babylonians came back, and they invaded Assyria, and the complete collapse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was in 609, where the Babylonians had just taken control of Syria. And at that time, the Assyrians, once they lost their homeland in Syria, they transferred all their wealth to Phoenicia. Okay, so this is what I call the end of the Assyrian dynasty and the beginning of the Phoenician dynasties. Okay. So around 609 was when all the wealth was transferred to Phoenicia, and they started becoming masters of the Mediterranean, and they started also building up the city of Carthage, right? Modern day Tunisia was the city of Carthage, right? So that was also just an Assyrian outpost, and the wealth was transferred to Phoenicia around 609.
It's interesting to note too, though, that these folks were living in areas that trade was their main source of income. Was they became expert traders, and they did traverse a lot of lands. I mean, like you're saying, you just said that it was an Assyrian outpost. They, and even like the clip I just played, they were just shrewd businessmen. That was that's one of those things that separates them from many other civilizations and cultures. I mean, a lot of these other areas, they have the traditional, farming backgrounds and certain things that they have in common, but for whatever reason, this particular culture it's all money.
Well,
It's you know
it also has to do with the slave trade.
Slave trade.
These
Yeah,
these people
just
these
trading in
people
general. Yeah, like
yeah,
we mentioned earlier, the purple dyes,
right,
stuff for the elites, human slavery, trading of human beings, and
right,
they they formed alliances with empires that were more powerful than them, and traded them. Um, I don't know if you came across this, but I mean, even when other empires wanted to dominate them, hey, well, cut us a deal, we'll supply you with this, and that's how they were spared many times. I mean, it didn't. I'm sure we'll get to it, but it didn't work out, towards the end. But that's how they survived a lot of times, because they offered monetaries. It's almost like the prehistoric Rothschilds. They would fund,
exactly,
you know what I'm saying? They were funding
exactly,
empires that even hated each other because they
right,
were controlling the money way back then. They're even credited with having maritime insurance way back then. It's pretty
Right.
freaking bananas, man.
Yeah. Let me jump back in here to the this. We're coming to the next period, which I call the Phoenician dynasties, right? And this is a very important history because this is where the whole first so-called first temple period, which never existed, So let's see here. It says here that the Babylonians, around 609, the Babylonians had destroyed Syria, and then they moved on to Phoenicia, and the Babylonians actually captured Phoenicia in the 604 BC. But the Babylonians had granted them semi-autonomous. They had the right to rule themselves as long as they paid tributes to the Babylonian kings, right? So they, when they had this semi-autonomous status, they did start making coins during this period, right? So I actually have coins, from this period, when the Phoenicians were were paying tributes to the Babylonians. Okay, let's jump back in. The official the so-called the Jewish historians who believe that there was a first temple. They say that the first temple was destroyed in 597 BC, and they say King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians captured the Jewish people and took them as slaves in the Babylon. But there is no historical evidence of this at all. But there are some ancient documents which they try to interpret as proof of this. But we might do another show on this later, because that can easily be debunked. Okay, so we might have another show on debunking this so-called first temple and debunking this so-called period of Babylonian captivity. Okay. So let's come back in here. I'll say, so now in 580 BC, there was the first war between the Greeks and the Carthaginians. Okay, the Carthage, which were the same as the Phoenicians. The Carthage was just a Phoenician outpost, right? So they first started butting heads with the Greeks in 580 in Sicily. It's the Sicilian Wars. The first of the Sicilian Wars was around 580 BC. And then there was another Sicilian War around 540 BC between the Greeks and the Carthaginians. Now, what happened was 539 was the rise of the Persian Empire. Okay, the ancient religion, the Zoroastrian religion. So actually, the the Jewish people like to say that Judaism was the first monotheistic religion, but that's not true. Zoroastrianism was also a monotheistic religion, which actually came before Judaism. So the Persians eventually captured Phoenicia, but they also granted the Phoenicians a semi-autonomous status to mint their own coins. So there are Phoenician shekels created during these period of Persian rule. So I actually have coins of this, many different Phoenician coins from this time period. So I want to mention something here. This is also very important. Now, what were the main cities of Phoenicia? Okay, what were the main cities? So of course, the capital of Phoenicia
Was
was
Tyre, right?
Tyre. Tyre, yeah, Tyre. I
Tyre,
actually don't know.
Biblios.
Yes, Byblos, Sidon,
Yeah.
Kition. Kition is another one. Then there was Arwad, and then the Berytus, and then you have another very famous city was Gaza. Gaza was an ancient seaport. Now, where does this city of Jerusalem fit in here? You have all these famous Phoenician cities: Tyre, Sidon, Biblios, Kition, Arwad, Berytus, Gaza, Edom, Moab, Acre, Tripoli, Ashkelon, Sarepta, Teldor. These were the famous Phoenician cities. Now,
What
where
about
does
Judah? Wasn't Judah an outpost as
yeah,
well?
Judah or Jerusalem. So now I'm
Yep.
going to come into that. Now, where
Okay.
does this city, Judah or Jerusalem, come in the picture? Now, now Gaza was a very famous city, and there's now if you from Gaza, if you cross the mountains, it's 100 kilometers inland, you come to Jerusalem. But that wasn't a very easy route. It was hard to cross the mountains during that time. So what happened was there was another seaport named Tel Qudadi. Tel Qudadi was another seaport, and there was a river which met the ocean there, and that river was called the Yarkon River. So if you travel up that river, the Yarkon River, you come to an ancient city which nobody knows the name for that city, but later on the Greeks and the Romans called the city Antipatris. So there was a city at the end of the Yarkon River called Antipatris, and from there was a very flat piece of land where there was a road, there was an ancient road which went from Antipatris to Jerusalem. Okay, so that's basically where the city of Jerusalem. It was kind of a hidden city. It was just a small little nobody. It was like, okay, you take this river up to the end, then you get to that city, and then there's another road which takes you down to Jerusalem. So it was pretty much a nobody city. It was a small. You had major cities like Gaza and Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Kition, Arwad. These are major cities, and Jerusalem was just a little nobody. It was kind of a hidden little city. you know so they're talking about there was no first temple. The religion of Judaism hadn't even been created yet. The you can look at the coins, because I have coins for all of these time periods. So the Phoenician people worshipped a god known as Melkart or something like that. It's an owl god. you know so they worship this owl god named Melkart.
Is that Moloch?
There are also some Phoenician statues of a bull,
Yeah.
and so anyway, this was you have the coins. All these Phoenician coins usually have like an owl on it, and that was their god. And even in in Jerusalem, you know, they also had a different god. So this
What was
monotheist
this God?
so-called
What did this God represent to them? What was? Do we know?
I don't know. But anyway, let's jump back into our timeline here. So this Jerusalem was just a tiny little nobody, and and I have coins, of from Jerusalem before they actually converted into Judaism. So let's come back to our timeline. So the okay, so as we mentioned, the Persians captured Phoenicia in 539 BC, and 516 BC is when they started building their first temple. Okay, But this is the temple which they called their second temple, but actually it's not a second temple; it's the first temple, because that's when they started evolving this monotheistic religion around 500 BC. So, the Old Testament gives a date of 516 BC, and I can agree with that. I have some coins from around that time, and but the only thing I don't agree with is that they call it a second temple, whereas I could no, this was just their first temple. Before that time, they had a they had this many different gods. It was not a monotheistic religion at that time. Okay, so now around around 514 BC, the Greeks and the Carthaginians started battling again, but this time they were battling in Libya. And 510 BC, the Greeks and the Carthaginians battled again in Libya. And now, finally, this is a very interesting point here. In 483 BC, the Greeks had divided. There was a civil war happening in amongst the Greeks, and they divided into two factions. They were known as the Ionians and the Dorians. So these Iorians actually turned to Carthage for help. We need your help to defeat these Dorians. And the Carthaginians actually helped these Ionians defeat the Dorians in 483 BC. And this was a big mistake on behalf of the Carthaginians because once they helped these Greeks, later on the Greeks just turned around and defeated them. So, so that was a big mistake for these Phoenicians, or you can call them the Carthaginians. But they were very powerful at that time. The fact that they could actually help the Greeks meant that these Carthaginians were at their peak of power at that time.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
you have,
they
yeah, go
started
ahead.
off as traders and stuff, and ended up having formidable navies. Their
Right, right.
navy was very superior, and I'm sure we'll go down when they meet against the Romans, up until the Romans, and
Right.
then the Romans found the chink in their armor. But their navy was pretty damn ferocious, man. They were excellent sailors, and
Yeah.
as a result of centuries of navigating.
Right. So that's one of the main points is that once the Phoenicians founded this city of Carthage, they really blossomed. Like I don't know what, they started having a lot of babies, and they were also really good at cutting down trees and building ships. They could manufacture ships, battleships, and they had so many children. So, they could have huge armies and navies, and, they were very powerful at that time. So this begins a period of what's known as the Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and the Carthaginians. And there was 7 Sicilian Wars. The first Sicilian War, the second Sicilian War, the third. So I just wanted to cover this period really quick. In 480 BC, the first Sicilian War, but the Greeks won. Now, in 410 BC was the second Sicilian War, and this time Carthage won. So that was definitely the peak of their power. The fact that their navy could actually beat the Greek navy and the Greek army was just incredible. They were so powerful at that time, 410 BC.
Well, another quick note: not only do they have a powerful navy, but they also engaged in bringing in war elephants.
Right.
And whenever they came to town with their damn elephants, can you think about this time period where people have horses, maybe most people are just on foot, and you go into battle, and the opposing team is coming in with some giant elephants. I mean, that was a scary sight, no question, and that comes later into play, when Hannibal comes in. But yeah,
Right.
that's just a side little note. As far as not only did they have a badass navy, they had war elephants at their possession.
Right. That's one of the main reasons why they're so powerful. They started using elephants to cut down the trees and bring the trees to the shipyard, and then use a battle elephant. Yeah. So let's come back to our Sicilian War. The Third Sicilian War in 393 BC, but this time the Greeks won. The Fourth Sicilian War, 383 BC, the Greeks won. The Fifth Sicilian War, 367 BC. But this time it sort of ended in a truce. The Greeks and the Carthaginians signed a peace treaty. But then later on, the Carthaginians broke that peace treaty and they invaded again. So in 345 BC was the Sixth Sicilian War, and the Carthaginians invaded again, but they lost. And then finally, in 332 BC, was Alexander the Great. So this was when the Greeks came to their peak of power. Okay, so let me just say here, Alexander the Great, he of course conquered Phoenicia with ease, and when when Alexander the Great conquered Phoenicia in 332 BC, all Phoenician coin minting stopped. Okay, so it's a very stark period in history where there's no more Phoenician coins after 332 BC.
It's also interesting that around this time period is when the alleged burning of the library at Alexandria coincides around this time period. So that's another interesting tidbit. Another. So not only did a lot of the records of the Phoenicians and a lot of that stuff get destroyed or hidden, it's the same thing that happened at the library as well.
Yes, and also this was when the Romans started coming to power as well.
Yeah, yeah.
The Greeks had reached their peak of power, but then all of a sudden the Romans appeared, and they're like, oh, they became much more. So let's jump into this next period. So this next period was after Alexander the Great conquered Phoenicia. Then all the wealth of Phoenicia switched to Carthage, okay, because it was like we no longer can mint our own coins in Phoenicia. So then you have a period of Carthaginian coins, okay? So I have a lot of coins from this period, the Carthaginian period, where it was like, okay, we lost Phoenicia, so let's all shift to Carthage. So you have a lot of Carthaginian coins coming from this period. So after Alexander the Great conquered Phoenicia, then there was one more Sicilian war called the Seventh Sicilian War. And at this time, the Greeks tried to invade Carthage itself, but they failed. Carthage was just way too strong at this time, you know, because the wealth of Phoenicia had been transferred to Carthage. Okay, so this Seventh Sicilian War was in 311 BC. Now, what happened after that was in 279 BC, the Carthaginians signed a peace treaty with Rome. Okay, the Carthage said, okay, the Greeks are no longer a challenge, but we see this upcoming Romans as a challenge, so we better sign a peace treaty with them. But then after that peace treaty, that peace treaty didn't last very long, and then what became known as the Punic Wars. And the Punic Wars were the wars between the Romans and the Carthaginians. Okay, so the first Punic War was in 264 BC, and Rome won. The Second Punic War was the 218 BC, and of course Rome won. And then the Third Punic War was in 151 BC, and of course Rome won. And finally, by 146 BC, the Romans had invaded Carthage itself and destroyed the city. Okay, so Carthage was destroyed. The Romans took control of Tunisia. So what happened after that? What happened after Carthage was destroyed? The wealth was shifted back to Phoenicia. Okay, now what was happening at that time was that at that time the Greek Empire was falling apart. Okay, so the Phoenicia was controlled by the Greeks, but that part of the Greek territory became known as the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids was the last remaining remnants of the Greek Empire, okay? But the Seleucid Empire itself was crumbling, okay? So now we have, at this period of time, we have what's known as the Maccabean Revolt, okay? Now, this Maccabean Revolt is supposedly the Jewish people of Jerusalem revolted against the Seleucid Empire. Now, the only source of information about this so-called Maccabean Revolt is Josephus, okay? There's no other sources of information. So it's not really, I don't know whether or not this so-called Maccabean Revolt really happened or not. Could have happened, but there's no other source outside of Josephus for this. And but let's look at the time period. This so-called Maccabean Revolt happened in 167 BC. Now, what was happening at that time? This was just before the Third Punic War. So what was happening was the Carthaginians saw the Romans coming. It's like, uh-oh, the Romans are coming and they're going to kick our butts. So some of these Carthaginians started transferring wealth to Phoenicia early. They saw the Romans coming. Oh, we better get out of here. So that's why it may be possible that this Maccabean revolt happened, because some of these Carthaginians who left early started transferring wealth to Phoenicia before the Romans came. It could have been that this was where the wealth came from to fund the Maccabean revolt. But, I don't know, because Josephus is the only source of information about that. But there is one thing that is very important, is that in 152 BC, the Tyrians, or Tyre, started minting their shekels again. It's called the Tyrian shekel. In 152 BC was when the Tyrians started minting their shekel. So that means that the Greek Empire was crumbling, okay, and they could not stop these. But what happened was this Tyrian shekel is, on one side is a Phoenician god, and on the other side is a Greek god. So it's very interesting, these Tyrian shekels. The Greeks, they still had control, even though their empire was crumbling. They still had control of Phoenicia. And they said, we will let you guys mint your own coins as long as one side of the coin has a Greek god on it. And on the other side of the coin, you can do whatever you want. So it's very interesting, these Tyrian shekels. And we can see how the Greek Empire was collapsing and the wealth of Carthage was shifting back to Phoenicia. Okay, now, regarding this so-called Maccabean revolt and the so-called Hasmonean dynasty, okay, yes, This is true because we start to see coins of this Hasmonean dynasty, or the Maccabees, the Maccabean coins, Hasmonean dynasty. So yes, you can find these coins. Now, when you look at the coins and you look at Josephus, okay, and you compare the two, they pretty much line up, okay? There's some discrepancies, okay, but you can prove here is where Josephus was telling the truth, because we have coins to prove it, okay? So this is where, in my opinion, this is where the only truth of the Old Testament comes here during this period, during this Hasmonean dynasty, because we have coins to prove that this really happened, you know. So in 134 BC, John Hyrcanus started minting coins, okay, in Jerusalem, okay. So we have these Jerusalem coins. Okay, the first one started being minted in 134 BC by John Hyrcanus, and then in 103 BC, Alexander Jannaeus, the next king of the Jewish people, started minting coins. And then in 76 BC, there were also some coins minted by some different kings, but these were unknown kings. We don't really know who these kings were. And these coins and the stories of Josephus don't really line up, you know. So we have some unknown kings who started minting coins at this time. And then in 63 BC, the Romans took over Palestine, you know. It was no more Greek control. The Romans took over. And the Romans did allow these Jewish people in Jerusalem to continue minting coins. So the final set of these so-called Jewish coins was Antigonus II in 40 BC. So we have some Jewish coins from Antigonus II after the Romans had taken over. Now, I want to jump back a little bit here because this is a very, very, very important story. It's in 49 BC. There's a famous story called Julius Caesar Crosses the Rubicon River. It's a very, very important story, okay? Now, what happened was Julius Caesar had gone up north to fight some battles, and then he was returning to Rome as a victor. You know, his army had won. And what happened was, before he crossed the Rubicon River and entered back into Rome, he had made a deal with the bankers. Okay, this is a very, very important. Okay, because the Romans, okay, the Romans had written in the Roman Republic. Okay, we're talking about the Roman Republic. Okay, the Roman Republic did not want to use precious coins as their currency. The Roman Republic had banned silver and gold coins. They said, no, you need they believed in what's called fiat currency. Fiat currency is when you use non-precious metals, or they even use bags of salt as their currency, right? So the Roman Republic was against gold and silver coins. Now, before Julius Caesar entered back into Rome, he had made a deal with these bankers. The bankers wanted to have gold and silver coins. So, when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and entered back into Rome, he started minting gold coins again. And this was what created the assassination of Julius Caesar. You know, the very famous story where all
The
the
conspiracy, one of the
right,
earliest documented conspiracies.
Right. So a lot of people don't know why they assassinated Julius Caesar. Everybody knows the famous story, "E tu, Brute, you also stick the knife in me." You know, that famous story. The reason why they assassinated Julius Caesar was because Julius Caesar started minting gold coins again, you know. And I actually have some of these coins started minted by Julius Caesar. So this is a very important because that's once Julius Caesar started minting the gold coins, the bankers took control of Rome, and that caused the collapse of the Roman Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire. You know, this is very important to understand.
Yeah,
Um,
that's fascinating right there. I mean that's
yeah,
something when we get taught the whole Julius Caesar story just gets it never gets mentioned. You
right.
just oh, it was just a conspiracy and he was just getting too much power. It was getting to his head. That's what we get told. But the real reason is he was going back to the
Let me jump back in because the thing is when you have a precious currency, right? When you have a currency in circulation which is made out of a precious material, then that means that currency can be controlled by those people who control that precious material, right? So the people who controlled the gold could manipulate the economy by withdrawing gold and adding gold and withdrawing gold cause economic depressions, economic collapse. Um, you know,
a
so this
la
was
the money changers.
right, right. So the Roman Republic knew that this was a bad idea. So that's why they were using a fiat currency. The non-precious materials were what the Roman Republic used. But once the gold and silver was introduced again, then it became very easy for the bankers to manipulate the politicians, you know, because the bankers controlled all the wealth. They controlled all the gold, the silver. They could manipulate the economy. They could buy out the politicians, right? So that's what you mean. Like, let me jump back into my timeline here. Okay. The year 37 BC is a very important year because this was when the Romans said no more. Okay. So, as I mentioned, um, even though even though the Rome had taken control of Phoenicia in 63 BC, they allowed the the Phoenician people to continue minting their own coins, right? So you have these Tyrian shekels, and you also have these Hasmonean coins from Jerusalem, you know. So they were, but in 37 BC, Rome said no more. You guys cannot mint your own coins anymore. So Rome installed a new system of governance known as the Herodian dynasty or King Herod the Great, you know. So this is true. I mean, I have the coins for this, so you can see when. So the Tyrian shekel stopped, and these Jewish Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, they also couldn't mint coins anymore. And then all of a sudden you had the Herodian dynasty. Now this is very important because this was a separation between church and state. Okay, before, when it was the Hasmonean dynasty, the church and the state were together. It means that the church issued the coins, right? And the church was the government. You know, they were the ones who made the laws. But Rome said, no, we are going to put our Herodian dynasty. So the Herodian dynasty had to be appointed by Rome. So this was a separation of the church and state. You know, the state was installed by the Romans, and the church, well, you guys can do whatever you want as long as you follow orders from the state, you know. So this was the situation, you know, when Jesus was born, was that there was a separation between church and state, and the church could basically do what they want. They still had their shekels. They were using the shekels as a temple tax, right? So if somebody wanted to go into the temple and buy the favor of God, it's like if you give money to the temple, you're buying God's favor, right? So Jesus was totally against that. That's why he went into the temple and threw the coins on the ground. He said, "This is a blasphemy. You can't buy the favor of God by exchanging your Roman coins for this temple tax." And this was the situation during the Herodian dynasty, was that there was a separation between church and state, right? So let's cover this Herodian dynasty really quick. Now, this is I think you'll find this very interesting, is that, as we all know, Jesus launched a protest, and the Jewish people were complaining to the Roman government. "Hey, this Jesus guy came into our temple and he launched a revolt. let's crucify him," right? The Jewish temple was asking Rome, Pontius Pilate, "Let's crucify Jesus." So Pontius Pilate asked Jesus, "Do you claim to be a Jewish Messiah or not?" Right? And Jesus, provided all these philosophical answers, but he didn't answer the question, you know. So Pontius Pilate said, "Okay, I'm washing my hands of this affair, right? You guys do what you want with him." So,
That's also when he asked Jesus, "What is truth?" Which is what
right,
inspired the my show's name in that
right. So
particular interaction.
right, so there was all this philosophical debate going on, and Pontius Pilate didn't want to be responsible for the death of Jesus, so he washed his hands. And but what's interesting here is that whether or not Jesus claimed to be a Messiah or not, that does regardless of that, he was not the first. There was many Jewish people who claimed to be Messiah at this time. Okay, so in the year 4 BC, there was a Jewish person by the name of Anthronges. Anthronges was a Jewish leader who claimed to be Messiah, and he led a revolt, okay, in the year 4 BC. And then in the year 6 AD, there was a guy named Judaeus of Galilee. Judaeus of Galilee also claimed to be a Messiah, and he also led a revolt, okay? And then in 30 around the year 30 AD, we don't know, but around the year 30 AD was supposedly when Jesus was crucified, and we don't know whether or not he claimed to be a Messiah or not. Probably didn't. Um, then finally, 44 AD was Theudas. Theudas was also another Jewish leader who claimed to be a Messiah. He also led a revolt. Okay, so there was all these Jewish revolts happening, and some of them claimed to be messiahs, and some of them didn't claim to be messiahs. Okay, and then in 46 AD, there was two brothers named Jacob and Simon, who also led another Jewish revolt. Okay, they didn't claim to be messiahs, but they also led a Jewish revolt. So there was all these Jewish revolts going on, and of course they were all suppressed. None of them could stand up. None of them could stand up against the Roman Empire. Now, here we have a very, very, very important event. This is the most important thing because this was the time of Josephus. Okay, now who was Josephus? Okay, Josephus was a banker. He traveled around. He owned ships. He was a trader, and he was very, very, very wealthy. He traveled to Rome, many times in his life. He was a trader who was very rich. His family was a very wealthy family and trading family, but they were Jewish people, of course. But they had, lived in Rome and were trading with the Romans. Now, what happened was in the year 66 AD, Josephus made a deal with Vespasian. This is very important, okay? So, what was this deal that Josephus made with Vespasian? Vespasian was an army commander, okay? At the time, Vespasian was an army commander. And Josephus said, this is so sick and twisted, but this is what happened. Josephus said, look, if you bring your army to Jerusalem and you kill my people, then I can use this as an excuse to claim that the end times have arrived, that now we're living in because according to the book of Ezekiel, when the Jewish people are destroyed, it means the Messiah will arrive. So, so Josephus said, look, he talked to this Roman army commander, you come down to Jerusalem, you slaughter my people, and then I can use this as an excuse to claim the end times have arrived, and I will help you become the next emperor, the next Roman
Holy
emperor.
shit. That- That's
So
that's one of these early primitive false flags. All the
yeah,
hallmarks of it, if you really
yes,
really think about it.
it's totally sick and twisted that he paid this Roman army leader to come kill his own people. It actually reminds me of the Holocaust.
So
What they
many
used to
things,
do.
but
So
even the story itself is just like your typical false flag. You
right,
stage an event, you blame it
to
on
get
some other.
you blame it on the puppet you put in
Yeah,
power.
yeah, and
Right,
then you have an agenda to work with.
right. So let's jump back into Josephus. So what happened was in 67 AD, Josephus returned to Jerusalem and started preaching, the end times have arrived, the end times have arrived. Then like the Vespasian, the Roman commander, brought his army down to Jerusalem and started slaughtering Jewish people. And so the Jewish people started getting behind Josephus and saying, hey, you were right, this is the end times, because this Roman army commander just started slaughtering our people. So then he could inspire more Jewish people to join his army. So then Josephus led an army against this Roman commander, who Josephus actually controlled the Roman commander. Okay, and then so this big slaughter happened, and then in the year 69 A.D. the Vespasian said, okay, I did what you wanted. I went down to Jerusalem. I invaded Jerusalem. Now it's your time to bring up your end of the bargain. You said you would help me become emperor. So then Josephus started using all his wealth to break apart, the Roman Senate. And what happened was it became known as the year of four emperors. There was four emperors that in a very short period of time, this emperor was thrown out, that emperor was thrown out. And finally, at the end of this, Vespasian became the new emperor. So in 69 AD. So now this was Josephus came up on his end of the bargain, and Vespasian became the new emperor, right? And then in 72 AD, Josephus returns to Rome as a hero because Vespasian had become the new emperor, and welcome back to Rome. And Vespasian gave him an official title, right? He became a Roman official now, and he gave him a nice house, and he even could marry a Roman woman as his wife. So Josephus became the official historian the Roman Empire. It's like, you can write the book now and tell us what is the history of the Jewish people. Okay? So the book, which you call the Old Testament, is a book written by Josephus after he had betrayed his own people and returned to Rome a hero and became the court historian for the Roman Empire. So this is what the Old Testament is.
So I guess I've got a couple of questions. What do you make of the Torah then? I mean
That's what
that
the Old Testament is, the Torah,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's the same.
that's the Old Testament
Right.
that uh, modern day Jewish folks claim is their book. And so many questions for me as a non-believer arise just in this time period. Okay, so for example, I usually point to Old Testament stuff, but you're saying you don't believe it. Uh, so where does everything emerge from then? Because in the Old Testament, you do have commandments, um, and certain things that lay the groundwork for the New Testament. If you're a believer in that, I'm just curious. This is just my own personal
Well,
curiosity.
yeah, you see that. So Josephus. Okay, this is just my opinion. Okay, but
Yeah,
Josephus wrote this Torah, or what you call the Old Testament, and that is just a book of fairy tales. But he did mix some truth with the fairy tales. Like, he talked about the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean dynasty, and he talked about the Herodian dynasty, and he couldn't, he had to tell the truth there, because that wasn't, he was living at the same time. So it's like, if he started lying about that, people would know it. It's because some people were still alive during those times. Oh yes, I remember the Hasmonean dynasty. There's people still alive during, so he couldn't make up, so he had to tell the truth about that, about the Hasmonean dynasty and the Herodian dynasty. But anything before that, like the so-called First Temple, the so-called Egyptian captivity, the so-called Babylonian captivity, these are all just fairy tales. You know, so like I say, most Jewish scholars agree with me on that point. Is that the Egyptian captivity is just fairy tale, but
yeah.
but
The
this
the
is where
whole
I,
Exodus, and
right, that's
yeah,
just the fairy tale. But all of the Jewish scholars say that the Babylonian captivity was real and the first temple was real. And this is where I differ from them. And I say,
and
no,
I,
no,
I
that's
guess
also fairy tale. So let me do my last little section here. As I mentioned, there's 7 periods of these so-called Phoenicians. The first period is the Akkadians, and the Assyrians, and the Phoenicians, and the Carthaginians, and then you have the Hasmonean dynasty and the Herodian dynasty, and then what I call the post-Herodian dynasty. So this is the last little section that I wanted to cover here now. So in 92 AD, the Romans had it. They're like, this Herodian dynasty is not working. We're just going to end this Herodian dynasty. Now, now, what happened after this post Herodian period? I just want to cover a few more dates because this is really important. Okay, so if you ask the Zionists, okay, they said that supposedly uh, the Jewish people were expelled from Israel, right? So when did this expulsion happen? So most of them give the date 70 AD as well. That's when the temple was destroyed and we were expelled from Israel. But that never happened, okay? And I'm about to kind of prove that to you. So what happened? Okay, after 92 AD was the end of the Herodian dynasty. So let's look at what happened after that. So in 115 AD, there was a Jewish revolt called the Kitos War, and this Kitos War was the Jewish people all over Palestine were, not only Palestine, the whole Phoenicia were revolting. And Josephus doesn't like to give attention to this Kitos War because Josephus only wants to give attention to Jerusalem. You know, what happened in Jerusalem is the most important, right? Because this is the holy city, right? So, but no, there was this Kitos revolt where the Jewish people who were not in Jerusalem were also revolting. And finally, the Jewish people of Jerusalem did revolt. That's called the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 AD. And then finally, in 136 AD, Emperor Hadrian put an end to this revolt. Okay, so the emperor himself came down to Jerusalem, and he did destroy the temple. He put a statue for the god of Jupiter on the Temple Mount. You know, so that supposedly the the Jewish temple, they say, was destroyed in 70 AD, but that's not true because it still existed in 136 AD when King Hadrian came down there and put a statue of Jupiter on the temple. So, and also one important thing, he changed the name to Palestine. He said this entire area is now called Palestine. You cannot refer to yourselves as Judea anymore. Okay, so the name Judea and the name Israel, you know, the name Israel didn't exist until 132 AD. Okay, 132 AD, the people of Jerusalem started minting a coin called the Jewish Temple Revolt coins. And on those coins it says year 1 Israel, year 1 Israel, year 2 Israel, year 3. So wait a minute. The name Israel was not even created until 132 AD. Okay, there's no proof of a name Israel anywhere in the ancient times. You know, so so finally in 136 AD, the Emperor Hadrian came down and says, no, 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 you can't call yourselves Israel anymore. You are Palestine. Okay, the city of Jerusalem is just one little city in the larger Palestine. Okay, so this happened in 136 AD. Now, in 177 AD, the Christianity had started growing, and Marcus Aurelius, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, started persecuting the Christians. And then in 193 AD, Emperor Septimus Severus, he said, well, the Christians are not any worse than the Jewish people. So that Emperor Septimus Severus started persecuting both Christians and Jewish people. And then finally, in 212 AD, Emperor Caracalla started helping both the Jewish and the Christian people. It's like, well, let's not persecute them. They're not such bad people as long as they follow the rules, you know. But then what happened was after that, the Jewish people got jealous. He's like, wait a minute, you can't treat us Jews the same way that you're treating those Christians. Okay, so the Jewish people started getting their revenge. And the way they did that was through economic means. So they initiated what's called the crisis of the 3rd century, which was a huge economic depression, which destroyed the entire Roman Empire, basically. And that started in 235 AD. Okay, so the crisis of the 3rd century was basically due to Jewish manipulation of the economy. Okay. Now, there's something very important that happened during this time, was that over in Iraq, there started forming a new school of Judaism. Okay, so that school of Judaism became known as the Babylonian Talmudists. Okay, so prior to that time, there was a book known as the Jerusalem Talmud, and then they started writing a new book called the Babylonian Talmud. And these were dark-skinned Jewish people known as the Mizrahi who were living in Iraq. So they started writing a new book, okay? So they started writing their book in 256 AD. And there was two schools in Iraq known as Sura and Pumbedita. So between these two schools, these Jewish scholars started writing a new book called the Babylonian Talmud. And that they started writing in 256 AD, and they finished writing their book in 745 AD. And this is important because we mentioned it in when we talked about the Khazarian Mafia, because the Khazarian Mafia uses the Babylonian Talmud as their holy book. But the Babylonian Talmud was not even written by them. The Babylonian Talmud was written by dark-skinned Jews, and then later, hundreds of years later, these white-skinned Jewish people stole that book from them and claimed it to be their book. Okay, so let's come back to my timeline here. In 270 AD, the crisis of the 3rd century ended. This financial depression, which lasted many years, ended when Emperor Aurelian granted equal rights to all. Okay, he's like, okay, Jews, Christian, Romans, we're all equal. So then the Jewish people were okay with that, and they let go of this economic hold that they had. And finally, in 325 was the time of Emperor Constantine, and the Council of Nicaea. So this was when Emperor Constantine was like, okay, I want to convert to Christianity. Now, important here is that one of the important things that Emperor Constantine said was that Christian people are not allowed to own slaves. Okay? If you are going to become a Christian, you're not allowed to own slaves. So that was a huge change. The Jewish people were still allowed to own slaves at that time. Okay? And also, and the second thing he said was, first of all, Christians are not allowed to own slaves, and second of all, Christians are not allowed to do usury, right? If you loan money, you cannot take interest on that loan, right? So this was a very great thing that the Constantine did. He ended slavery and he ended usury. Okay, so now, but he did create this Council of Nicaea. Okay, and as we all know, he pick and choose which books to put into the New Testament, right? Some books he threw out, and some books he kept in the New Testament, right?
Yeah,
and,
that's one of
go
those
ahead.
things. That whole Constantine thing is one of those. At least for me, is a red flag. Like, okay, who was the arbiter to? Okay, why did you remove that book? Why did you include
Right.
this book? And
Right.
that for me raises a crap ton of questions, because we'll never know why certain ones didn't make a cut. And so to me, that only adds to my speculation that there's a narrative being pushed, propaganda,
Right.
as I stated earlier,
Right.
because
Well, I
yeah,
can help answer that question a little bit. I'm not 100%, but partially. When Constantine called this Council of Nicaea, he not only called the Christians there, but he also called the many Jewish scholars there. And he said he wanted to link the Old Testament and the New Testament together. Okay? So, regarding this picking and choosing which books did he choose to keep and which books didn't make the cut, the books which didn't make the cut were the books which couldn't fit together with the Old Testament. Okay, So he wanted to paint a picture of Jesus as him being a Jewish Messiah, right? And so he had to edit some of the New Testament books in order to, I can't remember the exact quotes, but there's some lines like, I think it's Matthew. Well, there's only really, the New Testament, there's really only 5 books. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the rest of it was written by Paul, right? So in those 5 books, he was able to insert, certain Jewish ideas that Jesus claimed to be, a Jewish Messiah. But whether or not Jesus himself actually claimed that, I kind of doubt it. So this happened at the Council of Nicaea around 325 A.D. But let me finish off my timeline here. So in 351 AD was another Jewish revolt in the city of Galilee, Tiberias, and Lydda. Okay, so even though the Jewish people had helped Constantine write and put the Old Testament and the New Testament together, that was a great benefit for the Jewish people, that now all the Christians have to recognize our Old Testament. Even though that benefited the Jewish people were still not happy with these Christians. So they revolted again, just 20 years later, the Jewish revolt in 351 AD. And then in 363 AD, Roman emperor by the name of Julian rejected Christianity, and he converted back to the old Roman pagan religions, So even after Constantine, there was other Roman emperors who weren't even Christian, And so then finally in 388 AD, there was an emperor by the name of Magnus Maximus who actually favored the Jews over the Christians. Okay, so these Christians are creating more problems, and the Jews are actually helping us economically, So finally, that ended up in a civil war, and that civil war created a split between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. Okay, so this whole which one is better, Christianity or Judaism? This actually created a split and divided the Eastern Roman and the Western Roman Empire. Okay. Now, and that split started happening around the year 392 AD. And then finally in the year 439 AD, there was one Roman emperor named Theodosius wrote a treaty known as the Codex Theodosianus, which uh, created equality again, and it created an understanding between where does Judaism and Christianity fit together. How can these two get along? That's why he wrote that Codex Theodosianus, was to try to get the Christians and the Jews to get along. Like, you two are brothers, stop fighting against each other, And that kind of lasted for a little while, maybe. But then in 484, the Jewish people revolted again. Okay, they weren't happy with being considered equals to the Christians. So the Emperor Zeno was the emperor who had to put down a Jewish revolt in 484. And then in 495, Emperor Anastasius I had to put down another Jewish revolt. And in 529, Emperor Justinian I had to put down another Jewish revolt. In 556, Emperor Justinian I had to put down another Jewish revolt. In 572, Emperor Justin II had to put down another Jewish revolt. And then in 614 AD, Emperor Heraclius had to put down another Jewish revolt. So here we go. You're talking about the Jewish people were expelled from Israel when there was revolts going on all the way until 600 AD, you know? So it's like, when were the Jewish people expelled? They were never expelled. They were still living there. They were still creating revolts 600 years later, you know? So